Hello there, fellow seekers of hidden truths. Before we dive into tonight's story, I hope you're having a peaceful day, wherever you may be in this vast and mysterious world. I'm always curious about your corner of the earth. Let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are, and how has your day been? And while you're there, I'd love to hear your thoughts on tonight's topic, the Denver International Airport conspiracy. Do you believe the rumours about underground bunkers, secret symbols, and a deeper agenda beneath the surface? Or is it all just coincidence and speculation? Also, tell me, what conspiracy theory would you like to see explored next? Your suggestions often spark our most fascinating episodes. If you're new here, welcome to Sleep Theories, the place where shadows stretch long, facts and fiction blur, and the stories we tell may hold more truth than we're meant to know. If you enjoy tonight's journey, please consider subscribing. We've only just begun to scratch the surface. Tonight's tale takes us beneath one of America's most controversial airports, where infrastructure analyst Lena Morano discovers that some blueprints reveal more than just electrical systems and water pipes. Sometimes they reveal the architecture of conspiracy itself. Lena Morano had always found comfort in the predictable geometry of infrastructure. Power grids, water systems, subway tunnels. They all followed logical patterns that made sense when you understood the underlying principles. People were chaotic and unpredictable, but a well-designed electrical system would behave exactly as the blueprints promised, every single time. That's why she preferred working alone, armed with nothing but her laptop, measuring tools, and an encyclopedic knowledge of municipal engineering standards. At 32, she had built a reputation as one of the most thorough freelance infrastructure analysts in the Southwest. Her clients ranged from small municipalities checking their aging water systems to federal contractors who needed someone discreet and competent to verify that their projects met specifications. The Denver International Airport contract had come through Civic Grid, a federal subcontracting firm she'd worked with twice before. The job seemed straightforward enough. Audit the airport's internal power grid following a series of complaints about energy surges that had been causing problems with the baggage handling systems. The pay was excellent, almost suspiciously so for what appeared to be routine work, but Lena wasn't in a position to question good fortune. She'd been struggling to make ends meet since her father's death 6 months earlier. The cancer had eaten through his savings and hers, leaving her with a pile of medical bills and a grief that felt like a physical weight in her chest. This job would help her get back on her feet, financially and emotionally. Sometimes the best therapy was losing yourself in work that made logical sense. On a cold Monday morning in early March, Lena drove her Honda Civic through the sprawling complex of Denver International Airport, past the iconic white peaks of the terminal roof that resembled a mountain range or a series of circus tents, depending on your perspective. She'd read about the airport's unusual design and the various conspiracy theories that swirled around it, but she'd dismissed most of them as internet nonsense. People loved to see sinister patterns where none existed. The Civic Grid site office was located in a temporary trailer on the airport's eastern edge, near the cargo facilities. Gavin Bales, the project lead, was a thin man in his 50s with prematurely grey hair and the kind of nervous energy that suggested too much coffee and not enough sleep. He wore a rumpled white shirt and a tie that looked like it had been knotted in a hurry. "Morano, right?" "Good to meet you," he said, shaking her hand with a grip that was slightly too firm. "I've heard excellent things about your work. We need someone who can be thorough but discreet. This audit is strictly internal. No need to involve the airport's regular maintenance staff in our findings." Lena nodded, though something in his tone made her slightly uneasy. What exactly are we looking for? The initial briefing mentioned energy surges, but I'd like to understand the full scope of the problem. Bales pulled out a thick folder of blueprints and spread them across a folding table. The airport's been experiencing irregular power fluctuations, mostly in the lower levels. Nothing dangerous, but it's affecting some sensitive equipment. We need you to trace the electrical systems, identify any potential causes, and recommend solutions. The blueprint showed the airport's 3 official sub-levels, A, B, and C. Level A housed the main baggage handling systems, Level B contained mechanical equipment and storage, and Level C was designated for emergency systems and utility access. The electrical schematics were complex, but not unusually so for a facility of this size. "I'll need access to all 3 levels," Lena said, studying the drawings, "and I'll want to compare these blueprints with the actual installations to make sure everything matches." "Of course. Your security clearance came through this morning." Bales handed her a badge and a set of keycards. "These should get you into any area you need to access. Just remember, we're looking for electrical issues, not conducting a general facility inspection. Some areas of the airport are off limits for security reasons." Lena clipped the badge to her jacket and pocketed the keycards. "Understood. How long do I have to complete the audit?" 2 weeks should be sufficient. We'll need a preliminary report by Friday, and the final assessment by the end of the month." Bales began rolling up the blueprints. "One more thing. You might encounter some outdated maps or conflicting information in the airport's systems. The facility has been expanded and modified several times since it opened. If you find anything that doesn't match these official blueprints, don't worry about it. Some of the older documentation is just legacy data that hasn't been properly updated." There was something in the way he said legacy data that made Lena look up from her notebook. But Bales was already moving toward the door, checking his watch. "I'll let you get started," he said. "Feel free to call if you have any questions, but try to keep interruptions to a minimum. We're all very busy around here." After Bales left, Lena sat alone in the trailer, spreading the blueprints across the table and comparing them to the digital files on her laptop. Everything seemed to match, but she noticed something odd in the CAD drawings. There were electrical conduits and access panels marked for sub-levels D and E, even though these levels weren't shown on any of the architectural plans. She made a note to investigate the discrepancy. In her experience, inconsistencies in infrastructure documentation often revealed important information about how a system actually functioned, as opposed to how it was supposed to function according to the original design. The first few days of work proceeded normally. Lena spent her time in the upper levels of the airport, tracing electrical systems and checking circuit panels. The airport was a busy place, with thousands of passengers moving through the terminals each day, but the sub-level areas were quieter. She encountered maintenance workers occasionally, but most of them seemed too busy with their own tasks to pay much attention to her. On Thursday morning, she decided to investigate the electrical systems on sub-level C. According to the blueprints, this was the deepest level of the airport, containing emergency generators and backup systems. The elevator descended smoothly, and she stepped out into a long corridor lined with utility panels and mechanical equipment. The lighting was dimmer here, and the air had a different quality, cooler and somehow denser. Lena could hear the distant hum of machinery, but the corridor itself was empty. She consulted her blueprints and began systematically checking each electrical panel, comparing the actual installations with the documented specifications. Everything seemed normal until she reached the end of the corridor. According to the blueprints, there should have been a wall here, but instead she found herself facing a heavy steel door marked with a sign that read Gate C Vault, Authorized Personnel Only. Lena checked her blueprints again. There was no mention of any vault or secure area in this location. She tried her keycards, not expecting them to work, but to her surprise, the red light on the card reader turned green, and she heard the heavy click of electronic locks disengaging. The door opened to reveal an elevator shaft that descended into darkness. The elevator car was much larger than the standard passenger elevators in the airport, with walls that looked like they were designed to transport heavy equipment rather than people. There was no floor indicator, just a simple up and down button. Lena stood in the doorway, weighing her options. Bales had specifically told her to focus on electrical issues and not to conduct a general facility inspection. But she'd also been hired to identify any problems with the power grid, and if there were electrical systems in this vault area, they would need to be included in her audit. She pressed the down button. The elevator descended for what felt like several minutes, far longer than it should have taken to reach another sub-level. When the doors finally opened, Lena stepped out into a space that was unlike anything she had seen in the airport above. She was standing in a vast underground chamber, easily the size of an aircraft hangar. The ceiling was at least 30 feet high, supported by massive concrete pillars that disappeared into shadows at the edges of her vision. The lighting was provided by industrial fixtures that cast harsh, bright pools of illumination separated by areas of deep shadow. The walls were covered with murals that were similar to the famous artwork in the airport above, but these were different, unfinished, somehow more raw and disturbing. One wall showed what appeared to be a map of the world, but the coastlines were wrong, as if showing the continents after some catastrophic change in sea level. Another mural depicted a phoenix rising from flames, but the flames seemed to be consuming human figures that were barely visible in the shadows of the paint. Lena walked deeper into the chamber, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. Along the walls she could see the entrances to several corridors and smaller rooms. Most of the doors were labelled with symbols that looked like some kind of script, but not in any language she recognised. The characters were angular and geometric, almost like a stylised version of Arabic or Hebrew, but clearly something else entirely. In the centre of the chamber she discovered something that made her stop and stare. A set of railway tracks that disappeared into a tunnel at the far end of the space. The tracks looked new, as if they'd been recently maintained, but there was no train car in sight. Next to the tracks she found a small maintenance shed that contained what appeared to be a control panel for some kind of automated system. The control panel was covered with switches and gauges, but the labels were in that same strange script she'd seen on the doors. There was also a laminated map that showed what looked like a network of tunnels extending far beyond the airport grounds. The map was marked with symbols and abbreviations that meant nothing to her. HELIX DSMK Continuity 88. As she studied the map, she noticed something glinting on the floor near the control panel. It was a leather journal, bound with a cord and clearly old. The leather was worn and stained, as if it had been dropped and forgotten months or years ago. Lena picked up the journal and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and precise, written in blue ink that had faded slightly with age. Property of Dr. Elliot Creel, contract engineer, Denver International Airport Phase 2 construction. If found, please return to Civic Grid Project Office or contact the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Continuity Operations Division. The date on the first entry was June 15th, 1997, almost 30 years ago. Lena turned the page and began to read. Day 1. Arrived at DIA for what was supposed to be a routine inspection of the baggage handling systems. However, I've been reassigned to something called Blue Facility, a designation I can't find in any of the official project documentation. My security clearance has been upgraded, and I've been told that this assignment is classified under the National Security Act. I'm not sure what to make of this, but the pay increase is substantial. Lena continued reading, growing more disturbed with each entry. Day 5. Blue Facility is much larger than I initially understood. The official blueprints show 3 sub-levels, but I've now been given access to areas that extend at least 6 levels below the main terminal. The elevator system is completely separate from the passenger elevators, and some of the corridors extend for miles underground. I've been told this is all part of an enhanced baggage handling system, but I can't understand why such an elaborate network would be necessary. Day 12. I've discovered that the baggage handling equipment includes what appears to be a complete underground transportation system. There are multiple train lines, loading docks, and what look like holding areas that could accommodate thousands of people. When I asked my supervisor about this, he told me that all major airports have emergency evacuation procedures, but this seems far beyond what would be required for a normal emergency. Day 18. Found a room filled with what appear to be detailed maps of North America, showing population centres, transportation networks, and what I can only describe as resource allocation zones. The maps are marked with symbols that correspond to major airports in other cities. I'm beginning to suspect that whatever is being built here is not unique to Denver. Day 23. The murals in the upper terminal are apparently matched by similar artwork down here, but these are different, darker, more explicit about what they're depicting. One shows what appears to be a global catastrophe, with continents partially submerged and major cities destroyed. Another shows groups of people being led into underground facilities. I've been told these are historical murals depicting humanity's triumph over adversity, but they look more like blueprints for something that hasn't happened yet. Lena turned the page, but the next entry was written in a different handwriting, as if Creel had been writing in a hurry or under stress. Day 30. They know I've been asking questions. My access has been restricted, and I've been told that my assignment is ending early. But I've seen enough to understand what this place really is. This isn't an airport. It's a staging ground. The continuity program isn't about maintaining government operations during an emergency. It's about controlling what happens after the emergency. Day 31. I've made copies of some of the documentation and hidden them in a safe deposit box in downtown Denver. The key is taped under the drawer of my desk at home. If something happens to me, maybe someone will find this journal and understand what's really going on here. The final entry was dated July 2nd, 1997. They've scheduled me for a debriefing tomorrow morning. I don't think I'm going to make it home tonight. If someone finds this journal, please contact my wife, Sarah Creel, in Boulder. Tell her I love her, and tell her to stay away from the airports when the storms begin. The first storm wasn't the last. Keep moving. Lena closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. She looked around the vast chamber with new eyes, seeing not just an unused storage area but something more sinister. The train tracks, the control systems, the strange maps. It all suggested a level of preparation and coordination that went far beyond anything that should exist beneath a civilian airport. She checked her watch and realised she'd been underground for over 2 hours. It was time to get back to the surface and think about what she'd discovered. But as she walked back toward the elevator, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The elevator doors were closed and there was no call button on this side. Lena tried not to panic as she searched for another way out of the underground chamber. The elevator shaft was the only exit she could see, but there had to be emergency procedures for situations like this. She examined the elevator doors more closely and found a small emergency panel that could be opened with a coin or screwdriver. Using her house key, she managed to pry open the panel and found a manual override switch. After flipping it, she was relieved to hear the elevator machinery activate. The doors opened, and she quickly stepped inside, pressing the up button repeatedly until she felt the car begin to rise. When she emerged back onto sub-level C, she was surprised to find that the heavy steel door to the vault area was now closed and locked. Her keycard no longer worked on the reader, which now showed a steady red light. It was as if the system had reset itself while she was underground. Lena made her way back to the surface, her mind racing with questions. She needed to research Dr. Elliot Creel and find out what had happened to him. She also needed to understand what Continuity 88 referred to, and whether the underground facility she'd discovered was still active. That evening, in her apartment in downtown Denver, she began her investigation. A simple internet search for Dr. Elliot Creel returned dozens of results, but most of them were confusing or contradictory. According to some sources, he had been a civil engineer who had worked on several major infrastructure projects in the 1990s. Other sources suggested he had been involved in classified government work related to emergency preparedness. The most disturbing information came from a newspaper article dated July 15th, 1997, with the headline, "Local Engineer Missing After Airport Accident." The article was brief. Dr. Elliot Creel, 45, a consulting engineer working on Denver International Airport expansion projects, was reported missing after failing to return home from work on July 2nd. Airport officials say Dr. Creel was last seen entering a restricted area of the facility during a routine inspection. Search teams have been unable to locate him, and the investigation is ongoing. Dr. Creel is survived by his wife, Sarah, and 2 children. A follow-up article from several weeks later reported that the search had been called off, and that Dr. Creel was presumed dead in what officials described as an industrial accident in a restricted area of the airport. No body was ever found. Lena searched for more information about Sarah Creel and found an obituary from 2019. Sarah had died at age 78, and the obituary mentioned that she was predeceased by her husband, Dr. Elliot Creel, who had died in an accident in 1997. There was no mention of the circumstances of his death, or any surviving family members. Her next step was to research Continuity 88 in similar terms. This proved more difficult as most of the search results led to conspiracy theory websites or forums filled with speculation and wild theories. However, she did find some legitimate information about government continuity programs. According to several academic sources, the federal government had maintained various continuity of government programs since the Cold War, designed to ensure that essential government functions could continue in the event of a national emergency or catastrophic attack. These programs involved secure facilities, communication systems, and procedures for evacuating key personnel to safe locations. What was more disturbing was information about how these programs had evolved since the 1990s. Several researchers and journalists had documented evidence that the continuity programs had expanded far beyond their original scope, and that significant resources had been devoted to facilities and systems that seemed designed for scenarios much more severe than traditional nuclear attack or natural disaster. One article, published in a Journal of Emergency Management, mentioned that several major airports had been selected as continuity sites due to their existing infrastructure and strategic locations. The article didn't mention Denver International Airport specifically, but it did note that these sites were often expanded with enhanced underground facilities that could serve multiple purposes. Lena spent the next several days trying to balance her official audit work with her unofficial investigation. During the day, she continued her electrical system inspections, documenting everything according to the scope of her contract. But she also paid careful attention to any details that might relate to the underground facility she'd discovered. She noticed that several of the electrical panels on sub-level C had circuits that weren't accounted for in the official blueprints. When she traced these circuits, they led to areas that were listed as maintenance storage, but which appeared to draw significantly more power than would be needed for simple storage areas. She also discovered that the airport's emergency generator systems were much more extensive than what was shown in the official documentation. There were backup power systems that could apparently support the entire facility for weeks, not just the hours that would be expected for a normal emergency. On Friday afternoon, she submitted her preliminary report to Gavin Bales, focusing on the electrical inconsistencies she had found in the official areas of the airport. She mentioned the discrepancies between the blueprints and the actual installations, but she didn't mention the vault area or Dr. Creel's journal. Bales seemed satisfied with her preliminary findings and told her to focus on completing the electrical audit for the final report. He didn't ask any questions about the inconsistencies she'd noted, which struck her as odd for a project manager who should have been concerned about potential safety issues. That weekend, Lena decided to do more research on the history of Denver International Airport itself. She'd heard various conspiracy theories about the airport over the years, but she'd never taken them seriously. Now, however, she wanted to understand if there was any factual basis for the rumours and speculation. What she found was both fascinating and disturbing. The airport had indeed been the subject of numerous conspiracy theories since it opened in 1995. Some of these theories focused on the airport's unusual artwork, which included murals depicting scenes of war, peace, and environmental destruction. Other theories concerned the airport's layout, including runways that some people claimed were arranged in the shape of a swastika. More interesting were the theories about the airport's construction. Several sources noted that the airport had been built at a cost significantly higher than originally projected, with extensive underground construction that seemed disproportionate to the facility's stated purpose. There had been numerous reports of construction workers finding underground areas that weren't in the official plans, and several contractors had reportedly been dismissed from the project for asking too many questions. One particularly intriguing detail was the airport's Masonic time capsule, which was installed in 1994 and scheduled to be opened in 2094. The plaque marking the time capsule included Masonic symbols and referenced the New World Airport Commission, an organisation that apparently existed only for the purpose of the airport's construction. Lena found herself wondering if Dr. Creel's journal entries about resource allocation zones and staging grounds might be connected to these legitimate questions about the airport's construction and purpose. Was it possible that the conspiracy theories, despite their often outlandish claims, were based on something real? By Sunday evening, she had made a decision. She was going to return to the vault area and conduct a more thorough investigation. She would bring a camera to document what she found, and she would try to access some of the locked rooms that she'd seen during her first visit. But first she wanted to find out more about the key that Dr. Creel had mentioned in his journal. If he had indeed hidden documentation in a safe deposit box in downtown Denver, and if the key was still taped under the drawer of his desk at home, it might provide crucial evidence about what was really happening beneath the airport. Finding Dr. Creel's former address took some research, but she eventually located it through public records. The house was in a middle-class neighbourhood in Boulder, about 30 miles from Denver. According to the property records, it had been sold in 1998, the year after Dr. Creel's disappearance. On Monday morning, instead of going to the airport, Lena drove to Boulder. The house in Boulder was a modest 2-story colonial with a small front yard and a detached garage. It looked like it had been well maintained by its current owners, with fresh paint and a neat garden. Lena parked across the street and considered her options. She couldn't simply knock on the door and ask the current owners if she could search for evidence related to a missing person from 30 years ago. But she also couldn't break into the house or trespass on private property. She needed a different approach. After some thought, she decided to pose as a researcher working on a book about Denver International Airport. It wasn't entirely false. She was researching the airport, even if not for a book. She walked up to the front door and rang the doorbell. The door was answered by a woman in her 60s with greying hair and a friendly smile. "Can I help you?" "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Lena Morano, and I'm a researcher working on a book about Denver International Airport. I believe a man named Dr. Elliot Creel used to live here in the 1990s, and I was hoping to learn more about him. He was involved in some of the airport's construction projects." The woman's expression changed slightly. "Oh, yes, Doctor. Creel. We bought the house from his widow in 1998. Such a sad story. He disappeared, you know. They never found out what happened to him." "Did you know him personally?" "No, we never met him. But Sarah, his wife, was a lovely woman. She told us a little about what happened when we bought the house. She said he'd been working on some kind of government project, and that he'd been very stressed about it before he disappeared." Lena felt a surge of hope. Did she leave anything behind? Any papers or files that might help me understand what kind of work he was doing? The woman thought for a moment. "Well, there was his home office. Sarah cleared out most of his personal things, but she left some of the furniture. We've been using it as a guest room. There's an old desk that we never bothered to replace. It's a beautiful piece, solid wood. Would it be possible for me to take a look at it? I'm particularly interested in understanding the kind of work he was doing." "I suppose that would be all right. I'm Carol, by the way. Carol Henderson. My husband Tom is at work, but I don't think he'd mind. Come on in." Carol led Lena through a nicely furnished living room and up a flight of stairs to a small bedroom that had been converted into a guest room. In one corner was a large wooden desk with multiple drawers, exactly the kind of furniture that might have belonged to a professional engineer. Sarah said he spent a lot of time at this desk, Carol said. Sometimes she'd find him working here late into the night, especially toward the end. She thought the stress of his work might have contributed to whatever happened to him. Lena examined the desk carefully. It was indeed a beautiful piece, made of what looked like cherry wood with brass hardware. The drawers were empty, but she noticed that the bottom drawer seemed slightly shallower than the others. "Carol, would you mind if I looked under the drawers? I'm trying to understand how people stored important documents in the 1990s, before everything was computerized." "Of course, go ahead. Though I should mention that Sarah was very thorough when she cleaned out his things. I doubt there's anything left." Lena carefully pulled out the bottom drawer and set it on the floor. The inside of the desk was dark, but she could see that there was a gap between the bottom of the drawer space and the floor of the desk. She ran her fingers along the wood and felt something small and metallic taped to the underside of the drawer frame. It was a key. "Did you find something?" Carol asked, leaning over to look. "Just a key that was taped under here. Probably nothing important, but it might help me understand what kind of security he was dealing with in his work." Lena slipped the key into her pocket and replaced the drawer. She chatted with Carol for a few more minutes, thanking her for her time and promising to mention the house's history in her book if she decided to publish it. Back in her car, Lena examined the key more closely. It was small and brass, with a number stamped on one side. 247. It looked like the kind of key used for safe deposit boxes at banks. Her next challenge was figuring out which bank Dr. Creel had used. She drove back to Denver and spent the rest of the day visiting banks in the downtown area, particularly those that had been operating in the 1990s. At each bank, she explained that she was researching a family member who had disappeared in 1997 and that she had found a key that might belong to a safe deposit box. Most of the banks couldn't help her without proper documentation and proof of relationship to the deceased, but at the fourth bank she visited, First National Bank of Denver, she got lucky. The manager, an older man named Mr. Peterson, remembered Dr. Creel. "Oh yes, I remember him. He came in regularly for about 6 months in 1997, always seemed very nervous. He rented box 247 in April of that year. When we didn't hear from him for several years, we finally opened it according to state law. There wasn't much inside, just some papers and what looked like architectural drawings." "What happened to the contents?" "Well, we tried to contact his wife, but she said she didn't know anything about a safe deposit box. She didn't want the contents, so we kept them in our unclaimed property files. We're supposed to turn them over to the state after 10 years, but to be honest, we've never gotten around to it. There's a whole file cabinet full of unclaimed items going back decades." Lena felt her heart racing. "Would it be possible for me to see what was in the box? I'm researching the airport project he was working on, and it might be relevant to my work." Mr. Peterson considered this. "Well, the property is technically abandoned and you did have the key. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to let you look at the papers, but I can't let you take anything without proper legal documentation." He led her to a storage room behind the main bank and pulled out a file cabinet. Box 247's contents were in a manila envelope marked with Dr. Creel's name and the date the box had been opened. Inside the envelope were copies of blueprints, photographs, and several typewritten documents. The blueprints showed the same underground facility that Lena had discovered, but in much more detail. They included areas that she hadn't seen, including what appeared to be a large assembly hall, dormitory-style sleeping quarters, and rooms marked as medical facilities and communication centres. The photographs were even more disturbing. They showed the underground facility during what appeared to be its construction phase, with workers installing equipment and infrastructure. But they also showed rooms filled with what looked like military equipment, including vehicles and supplies that had no apparent connection to airport operations. The typewritten documents were copies of memoranda and reports, all marked with various classification levels. One document was headed Continuity of Government Exercise 88, Denver Implementation Phase. It outlined a program designed to maintain essential government functions during extended national emergency scenarios, and referenced population management protocols and resource allocation frameworks. Another document was titled ARC Terminal Network, Phase 1 Implementation. It described a network of 6 facilities, all located beneath major airports, that were designed to serve as continuity sites for government operations. The airports listed were Denver, Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, and Miami. The most disturbing document was a report titled Population Density Management During Crisis Scenarios. It described procedures for managing civilian populations during extended emergency periods, and included detailed maps showing population concentration zones and resource distribution points throughout the western United States. As Lena read through the documents, she began to understand the scope of what Dr. Creel had discovered. This wasn't just about maintaining government operations during an emergency. It was about controlling large populations during what appeared to be a planned crisis. "This is quite a collection," Mr. Peterson said, looking over her shoulder. "I always wondered what kind of work he was doing. Looks like it was pretty important." "Yes, it was," Lena said quietly. "Mr. Peterson, I know you can't let me take these documents, but would it be possible for me to make copies? This could be very important for understanding what happened to Dr. Creel." Mr. Peterson thought about this for a moment. "Well, I suppose that would be all right. The copy machine is right outside." Lena spent the next hour copying every document and photograph in the file. As she worked, she found herself thinking about Dr. Creel's final journal entry. The first storm wasn't the last. Keep moving. Was he referring to a literal storm or something more metaphorical? And what did he mean by keep moving? By the time she finished copying the documents, it was late afternoon. She thanked Mr. Peterson and returned to her apartment, where she spread all the evidence across her kitchen table. The journal, the blueprints, the photographs, and the classified documents painted a picture of a conspiracy that was far more extensive and disturbing than anything she could have imagined. But she still had one more step to take. She needed to return to the vault beneath the airport and document everything she could find. With the detailed blueprints from Dr. Creel's safe deposit box, she would be able to navigate the underground facility more systematically and gather the evidence she needed to expose what was really happening. She decided to make her final descent the next evening, when the airport would be less busy and she would have more time to explore without interruption. Tuesday evening, Lena arrived at the airport with a backpack containing a high-quality camera, extra batteries, a flashlight, and copies of all the documents she'd discovered. She also brought a small crowbar in case she needed to open any locked doors or access panels. The sub-level areas were even quieter than usual, with most of the maintenance staff having finished their shifts. She made her way to the vault door without encountering anyone, and was relieved to find that her keycard still worked. The door opened with its familiar heavy click, and she stepped into the elevator. This time she was prepared for the long descent. She used the time to review Dr. Creel's blueprints, planning her route through the underground facility. According to the documents, there should be a main control room somewhere near the centre of the complex, and that would be her primary target. When the elevator doors opened, she immediately began taking photographs. The vast chamber looked exactly as she remembered it, but now she understood its purpose. This wasn't just a storage area, it was a staging ground for operations that could potentially affect millions of people. She followed the railway tracks toward the tunnel at the far end of the chamber, documenting everything she saw. The tunnel led to a series of platforms that looked like they were designed for loading and unloading large numbers of people. According to the blueprints, this was connected to a network of tunnels that extended far beyond the airport grounds. In one of the side corridors, she found a room that matched the communication centre, shown in Dr. Creel's blueprints. The room was filled with sophisticated electronic equipment, much of it bearing labels from companies she didn't recognise. There were also several computer terminals, but they appeared to be powered down. The most disturbing discovery was a room marked with symbols that she now recognised as the same script she'd seen throughout the facility. Using her small crowbar, she managed to force open the door and found herself in what appeared to be a medical facility. There were examination tables, medical equipment, and cabinets filled with supplies, but there were also restraints and equipment that looked more suited to a detention facility than a hospital. As she photographed the medical facility, she heard a sound that made her freeze, the distant rumble of machinery starting up. The lights in the facility began to flicker, and she could hear what sounded like ventilation systems activating throughout the complex. She quickly gathered her equipment and headed back toward the main chamber, but as she reached the central area, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The railway tracks were no longer empty. A sleek, modern train car had arrived silently while she was exploring the side rooms. The car was unmarked except for the letters HELIX stenciled on its side. As she watched from the shadows, several people in dark uniforms emerged from the train car. They moved with military precision, setting up equipment and speaking into radio headsets. One of them was a tall man in a tan trench coat who wore what appeared to be a TSA badge. Lena recognised him from a photograph in Dr. Creel's documents, Victor Graal, supposedly dead since 2004. She crept closer, using the concrete pillars for cover, and managed to photograph the activity around the train. The uniformed personnel were unloading crates marked with symbols she recognised from the documents, the same symbols associated with Continuity 88. But as she adjusted her position to get a better angle, her foot knocked against a loose piece of concrete. The sound echoed through the chamber, and several of the uniformed figures immediately turned in her direction. "Sector 7! We have a possible breach," one of them spoke into his radio. "Initiating containment protocols." Lena ran. She sprinted toward the elevator, but as she reached it, she found the doors were closed and unresponsive. The call button didn't work, and the manual override panel had been sealed. Behind her, she could hear footsteps and radio chatter as the search team spread out through the facility. She needed another way out, and according to Dr. Creel's blueprints, there should be emergency exits that connected to the upper levels. She found a service corridor that led away from the main chamber and followed it deeper into the complex. The corridor was lined with pipes and electrical conduits, and she could hear the pursuit behind her growing more distant. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she found a service ladder that led upward. The ladder climbed through a narrow shaft for what must have been several stories before reaching a heavy metal hatch. She pushed against it with all her strength, and it finally gave way, allowing her to emerge into a utility room on sub-level A. She was back in the familiar territory of the airport's official infrastructure. She made her way through the maintenance areas and took a passenger elevator to the main terminal, trying to look casual despite her dishevelled appearance and racing heart. As she walked through the terminal toward the exit, she noticed something that made her pause. The airport seemed unusually busy for a Tuesday evening, with long lines of passengers and a sense of urgency that didn't match the normal rhythm of air travel. She approached one of the information monitors and saw that a severe weather warning had been issued for the Denver area. A massive winter storm was approaching, with predictions of heavy snow, high winds, and potential power outages. The airport was recommending that passengers arrive early due to possible flight delays and cancellations. Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Dr. Creel's final journal entry echoed in her mind. The first storm wasn't the last. Keep moving. She hurried to her car and drove home through increasingly heavy snow. The radio was full of weather updates and emergency preparation advisories. The storm was being described as potentially historic, with the possibility of shutting down the entire Denver metropolitan area for several days. Back in her apartment, she uploaded all the photographs she'd taken and began organising the evidence she'd gathered. She needed to get this information to someone who could act on it, but she wasn't sure who she could trust. The conspiracy involved federal agencies and government contractors, which meant that normal law enforcement channels might not be safe. As she worked, the storm outside intensified. The wind howled around her building and the power flickered several times. She could hear emergency sirens in the distance, and the local news was reporting that the airport had been closed indefinitely. Around midnight, her phone rang. The caller ID showed her father's name. Her father had been dead for 6 months. "Hello," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. "Lena." It was her father's voice, exactly as she remembered it. "You found it. That's enough. Go back now." The line went dead. Lena stared at the phone, her hands shaking. She tried to convince herself that it had been a prank call, or some kind of technical glitch, but the voice had been unmistakably her father's. Not just the sound of it, but the way he spoke, the slight accent he'd never quite lost, the particular warmth he'd always used when saying her name. She looked at the evidence spread across her table, the photographs, the documents, the journal. She thought about Dr. Creel, who had tried to expose the truth and had vanished. She thought about the underground facility, the train cars marked with mysterious acronyms, the medical equipment that looked more like instruments of detention than healing. But she also thought about the voice on the phone and the strange certainty in her father's words. That's enough. The storm raged outside and she could hear the city shutting down around her. The power went out shortly after 1 a.m, plunging her apartment into darkness. She gathered the most important documents and put them in a waterproof bag, then lay down on her couch to wait for morning. She woke up 3 days later in her own bed, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The storm had passed, and bright sunlight was streaming through her windows. Her apartment was clean and organised, with no sign of the documents and photographs that had covered her kitchen table. Her laptop had been wiped clean. Her camera was missing. The copies of Dr. Creel's documents were gone. There was no record of her ever working for Civic Grid. When she called Gavin Bales, the number was disconnected. When she searched online for any mention of her audit contract, she found nothing. It was as if the entire experience had been erased from reality. But on her kitchen counter, she found a single white envelope with her name written on it, in handwriting she didn't recognise. Inside was a brief note. The first storm wasn't the last. Keep moving. E.K. Lena packed a bag that afternoon and left Denver. She drove west without any particular destination in mind, just following Dr. Creel's final advice to keep moving. She didn't know if she was running from something or toward something, but she knew she couldn't stay. As she crossed the Colorado state line, she looked back in her rearview mirror at the mountains surrounding Denver. Somewhere beneath that sprawling airport, the machinery was still running, the trains were still moving, and the vault beneath Gate C was still waiting. She thought about the voice on the phone, her father's voice telling her that what she'd found was enough. Maybe he was right. Maybe knowing the truth was enough, even if she couldn't prove it or share it with the world. But as she drove through the gathering dusk, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm Dr. Creel had warned about was still coming. And when it arrived, she would need to be far from Denver and ready to keep moving. The vault beneath Gate C had shown her a glimpse of what lay hidden beneath the surface of the normal world. Now she would spend the rest of her life wondering when that hidden world would finally reveal itself, and what would happen to everyone who hadn't been warned to keep moving when the first storm began. Behind her, the lights of Denver disappeared into the distance, but she knew they would never really leave her. Some secrets, once discovered, became part of you forever. And somewhere in the darkness behind those lights, the machinery hummed on, waiting for the signal to begin whatever it had been built to do. The summer of 1998 was suffocating in suburban Ohio. 10-year-old Silas Greer lay in his bed, sheets kicked off, staring at the ceiling fan that barely moved the thick air. Sleep was a stranger to him then, had been since he was 7. While other kids his age were dreaming of baseball and bicycles, Silas was discovering the strange world that existed after midnight, when the normal rules seemed suspended and the impossible felt possible. That's how he found Coast to Coast AM. Art Bell's voice was like a beacon in the darkness, smooth and knowing, speaking to the insomniacs and the curious, the believers and the skeptics. Silas had discovered the show 3 months earlier, accidentally, when his father's radio had been left on after a late-night fishing report. Now it was ritual. Every night he'd tune in on his small transistor radio, volume low enough that his parents wouldn't hear, but clear enough that Bell's voice could carry him through the endless dark hours. July 29th, 1998. A Wednesday night that would change everything. Bell was in his element that evening, fielding calls about UFO sightings in Nevada, discussing the latest conspiracy theories about Area 51. Silas had heard it all before. The show had its regular callers, its familiar rhythms. But then Bell's voice took on a different quality, more serious, more intrigued. Folks, I've just received a fax that's, well, it's something else entirely. This comes from someone calling himself John Titor, and he claims to be writing from the year 2036. Silas sat up in bed, suddenly alert. Time travel stories were common on Coast to Coast, but there was something in Bell's tone that suggested this was different. Now, I've read a lot of these over the years, Bell continued, but this one is remarkably detailed, remarkably specific. Let me read it to you. The fax was unlike anything Silas had ever heard. This John Titor person spoke with clinical precision about future events. A civil war that would tear the United States apart by 2005, a mission to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer from 1975, something called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. But what struck Silas most was the voice behind the words. Even filtered through Bell's reading, there was something desperate about it, something urgent. "I am a time traveller from the year 2036, Bell read. "I'm on my way home after getting an IBM 5100 computer system from the year 1975. My time machine is a stationary mass temporal displacement unit powered by 2 top-spin dual positive singularities that produce a standard offset Tipler sinusoid." The technical jargon washed over Silas, but he grabbed his notebook, the one he kept for recording interesting things he heard on the show, and began sketching. He drew timelines, tried to capture the dates Titor mentioned, the strange sense of inevitability in his words. "The Civil War in America will start in 2005, Bell continued reading. "By 2015, Russia will launch a nuclear strike against the major cities in the United States, China and Europe. The US cities are destroyed along with the AFE American Federal Empire. The European Union and China will also be destroyed. Oddly enough, Russia is not a target." Silas's pencil moved frantically across the page. Something about this felt different from the usual coast-to-coast fare. This wasn't someone looking for attention or trying to sell a book. This felt like a warning, like a message in a bottle thrown across an ocean of time. But then something strange happened. The broadcast began to experience interference, static that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. Through the white noise, Silas could swear he heard another voice, fainter than Bell's but distinct. It sounded like it was saying something, but the words were lost in the electronic snow. Bell paused in his reading. "We're having some technical difficulties here, folks. Bear with us." The static continued for nearly 30 seconds, and then cleared as suddenly as it had begun. Bell resumed reading, but Silas noticed something odd. The flow of the text seemed different now, as if something had been skipped over. "Well, that's quite a fax," Bell said when he finished. "John Titor from 2036. If you're listening, John, give us a call. I'd love to hear more about this time machine of yours." But no call came. The show moved on to other topics, other mysteries. Silas, however, remained fixated on what he had heard. He spent the rest of the night filling his notebook with questions, theories, timelines. There was something about the tighter facts that felt unfinished, as if the static had interrupted something important. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself returning to those notes again and again. He checked the official coast-to-coast archives, but the version posted online seemed shorter than what he remembered hearing. Some of the details felt missing, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. The summer ended, school began, and life moved forward. But Silas never forgot that night, never forgot the urgency in those words read by Art Bell's familiar voice. He kept the notebook, even as he grew older, even as the memory began to feel more like a dream than a real experience. He had no way of knowing that 27 years later, he would discover that his childhood memory was more accurate than any official record, and that the missing pieces of that broadcast would lead him into a conspiracy that stretched across decades and possibly across time itself. 2025 arrived with the same quiet desperation that had marked the previous few years. Silas Greer, now 37, and bearing the weight of too many sleepless nights, worked in a building that didn't officially exist. Division Calder occupied 3 floors of a nondescript office complex in McLean, Virginia, hidden beneath the innocuous nameplate of the Federal Data Compliance Agency. His job title was Classified Systems Analyst, which meant he spent his days diving into the digital archaeology of government databases, tracking down corrupted files, fixing network vulnerabilities, and occasionally stumbling across information that reminded him why his security clearance came with a lifetime non-disclosure agreement. The work suited him. It was methodical, solitary, and allowed him to disappear into the intricate puzzles of data systems. Most importantly, it kept his mind occupied during the day, which made the sleepless nights marginally more bearable. On a Tuesday morning in March, Silas was conducting a routine audit of the division's network infrastructure when he noticed something unusual. A relay node in the deepest part of the system was showing signs of corruption. Not the usual degradation of old hardware, but something more deliberate. The corruption patterns were too regular, too purposeful. Following the digital breadcrumbs, Silas traced the compromised node to an offline vault he had never seen before. The access path was buried beneath layers of security protocols, and the vault itself was labelled with a designation that made his pulse quicken. Orpheus 99, Titor Incident, Division SP Delta. Titor. The name hit him like a physical blow, dragging him instantly back to that summer night in 1998, to Art Bell's voice reading impossible words from an impossible source. For 27 years that memory had lived in the back of his mind, a strange childhood fixation that he'd never quite been able to shake. His hands trembled slightly as he initiated the access protocols. His clearance level was sufficient, barely, but he had to route through several proxy servers to avoid triggering automatic monitoring systems. Whatever was in this vault, it was meant to stay buried. The files began to populate on his screen, and Silas felt his worldview tilt on its axis. Operation Echo Prism was the primary designation. The associated documents painted a picture that was both impossible and terrifyingly plausible. The files contained logs referencing Temporal Incursion 001, codename TITOR, along with directives marked Retroactive Suppression and Narrative Severance Protocol. But it was the audio file that stopped his heart. The file was labelled Coast to Coast AM072998 uncut.wav and was significantly larger than any archived version of that broadcast should have been. Silas's hands shook as he downloaded it to a secure partition and opened it in an audio editing program. Art Bell's voice filled his headphones, exactly as he remembered it from that night 27 years ago. The familiar cadence, the careful reading of the tighter facts. But as the broadcast progressed, Silas began to notice discrepancies. The version he was hearing was longer, more detailed. The static that had interrupted the broadcast was there, but it was different, more structured, more purposeful. And then, as the static cleared, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Another voice, faint but distinct, speaking over the interference. Not Art Bell's voice, but something else entirely. The words were distorted, but with some audio manipulation, Silas was able to enhance them. "They found me. I never meant to be here. Don't trust the timeline. It's being rewritten." The voice was desperate, terrified, and it was definitely not part of the original broadcast. Silas sat back in his chair, staring at the waveform on his screen. This was impossible. The file was clearly authentic. The metadata showed it was recorded directly from the coast-to-coast AM broadcast feed. But this enhanced version contained material that had never been publicly archived. He spent the next several hours diving deeper into the ORPHEUS files. What he found painted a picture of a government operation that defied everything he thought he knew about reality. Project Locust Vale appeared to be some sort of information warfare initiative, designed to suppress or alter public perception of specific events. The Titor incident was listed as the final uncollapsed vector in a series of what the files called temporal anomalies. The document suggested that the John Titor who'd sent that fax to Art Bell was not a hoax, not a creative fiction, but something far more dangerous, a genuine disruption to the timeline that had required immediate containment. According to the files, the original broadcast had been intercepted and edited in real time. The version that was archived and distributed publicly had been carefully sanitized, with the most alarming elements removed. The static that Silas remembered was actually the sound of the timeline being corrected, whatever that meant. But perhaps most disturbing of all was a series of voice print analyses comparing the mysterious second voice in the static to various archived recordings. The analysis showed a match to 3 encrypted internal calls, all made from phones within government facilities. One of those calls was time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. on July 29th, 1998, the same night as the original broadcast. Silas stared at the screen until his eyes burned. If these files were genuine, then everything he thought he knew about the Titor incident was wrong. The hoax wasn't John Titor's claims about time travel. The hoax was the cover-up, the carefully constructed narrative that had been designed to make the truth look like fiction. He made copies of everything, storing them on encrypted drives and hidden partitions. Something told him that his access to these files wouldn't last long. Whatever Division Calder was really doing, and whatever the truth about John Titor really was, powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it buried. As he prepared to leave the office that evening, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The familiar paranoia of his profession had taken on a new intensity. He had always known that information was dangerous, but this was different. This felt like he had stumbled across a secret that could rewrite history itself. That night, for the first time in weeks, Silas didn't have trouble sleeping. But his dreams were filled with static, with voices calling across impossible distances, with the growing certainty that the past was not as fixed as he had always believed. The obsession consumed him. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself spending every free moment analysing the Orpheus files, comparing the uncut broadcast with public archives, and trying to piece together a timeline that made any kind of sense. He started with the basics. The original Coast to Coast AM broadcast from July 29th, 1998, was publicly available in multiple archives, but when he compared these versions with the uncut file he'd discovered, the differences were subtle but unmistakable. Entire sections had been removed, not just edited but completely excised from the historical record. The public version of the broadcast ran for exactly 47 minutes and 32 seconds. The uncut version was 51 minutes and 18 seconds long. Nearly 4 minutes of material had been removed, and the editing was so seamless that it was impossible to detect without a direct comparison. But it wasn't just the length that was different. The content itself had been altered. In the public version, Titor's message was presented as an interesting curiosity, a well-crafted piece of science fiction that Bell read with his usual mix of skepticism and entertainment. In the uncut version, Bell's tone was different, more serious, more concerned. There were moments where he paused, as if he was grappling with the implications of what he was reading. "Folks, I have to tell you," Bell said in the uncut version, "this is unlike anything I've ever received. The level of detail, the technical specifications, this doesn't read like someone's creative writing project. This reads like a field report." Those words didn't exist in any public archive. Silas began to dig deeper, tracking down early internet discussions of the Titor incident. He found references to the original broadcast in archived Usenet groups and early web forums, but many of the most detailed discussions had been removed or altered. It was as if someone had gone through the early internet with a fine-toothed comb, systematically removing or modifying any reference to the uncut version of the broadcast. The more he investigated, the more convinced he became that the Orpheus files represented a massive information warfare operation. Someone with significant resources and access had gone to extraordinary lengths to alter the historical record of the Titor incident. But why? What was so dangerous about John Titor's message that it required this level of suppression? The answer came when Silas began analysing the metadata embedded in the ORPHEUS files. Hidden within the digital fingerprints of the documents was a wealth of information about their origins and the people who had created them. The files had been compiled by something called the Temporal Anomaly Research Division, which appeared to be a joint operation between the NSA, the CIA, and a private contractor called Meridian Dynamics. The project had been running since 1947, originally focused on what the files called chronological inconsistencies, events that seemed to violate the normal flow of cause and effect. The Titor incident was classified as a Type 7 temporal anomaly, defined as direct communication from an alternate or future timeline. According to the files, the government had been tracking and suppressing temporal anomalies for decades. The Titor incident was significant because it was the first time such an anomaly had occurred in a public forum, broadcast live to millions of listeners across the country. The files contained detailed analysis of Titor's message, breaking down not just the content, but the linguistic patterns, the choice of words, even the rhythm of the sentences. The conclusion was unanimous among the analysts. This was not a hoax. The message showed signs of what they called temporal displacement syndrome. linguistic patterns that suggested the author was experiencing time in a non-linear fashion. But perhaps most disturbing was the section labelled Containment Protocols. The files outlined a comprehensive plan to discredit the Titor incident through a combination of disinformation and narrative manipulation. False information would be seeded into online forums, creating a confusing web of contradictory claims that would make it impossible for anyone to determine what was real and what was fabricated. The plan had worked perfectly. By 2001, when someone calling themselves John Titor began posting on internet forums, the narrative had been so thoroughly corrupted that the real message was lost in a sea of science fiction and hoax claims. Silas spent hours studying the forum posts attributed to John Titor, comparing them with the original facts that had been read on Coast to Coast AM. The differences were striking. The forum posts were elaborate, entertaining, and full of the kind of time travel technobabble that science fiction fans loved. The original facts was terse, technical, and terrifying in its implications. The forum posts were the disinformation campaign. They were designed to turn John Titor into a figure of fun, an internet legend that no one would take seriously. The real John Titor, the one who had sent that fax to Art Bell, had been erased from history. But who was he? And where had he come from? The answer to that question would lead Silas down a rabbit hole that would shake his understanding of reality itself. The first sign that Silas had attracted unwanted attention came on a Thursday morning in late March. He arrived at his desk to find that his security badge had been downgraded. Not revoked entirely, but his access to certain systems had been restricted. When he tried to access the Orpheus files, he was met with an error message he'd never seen before. Access denied, subject classification under review. His supervisor, a thin man named Carson, who rarely spoke and never smiled, appeared at his cubicle within minutes. Greer, there's been a security audit. Some irregularities in your access patterns. Nothing serious, but you'll need to stick to your assigned projects for the next few weeks while we sort it out. Silas nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Of course, whatever you need. But Carson's eyes lingered on him for a moment too long, and Silas got the distinct impression that this was not a routine security audit. Over the following days, the surveillance became more obvious. His computer would crash at exactly 2:11 a.m. every night, regardless of whether he was using it or not. The crashes were too regular, too precise to be coincidental. Someone was monitoring his system and shutting it down at predetermined intervals. His attempts to communicate with the outside world were also being interfered with. Emails to friends and family would bounce back as undeliverable. His phone calls would drop after exactly 3 minutes. Even his internet searches were being filtered. Certain keywords would return no results, while others would redirect him to innocuous websites. But it was the woman in the slate trench coat who confirmed his worst suspicions. She appeared on Monday morning, standing across the street from his office building. Tall, professional-looking with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She stood in the same spot for exactly 15 minutes from 8:45 to 9 a.m, then disappeared. The next day she was back, same time, same position. By Friday, Silas had confirmed the pattern. The woman appeared every morning at 8:45 a.m. and every evening at 5:15 p.m. She never looked directly at the building, never made any obvious attempt to observe him, but her presence was too regular to be coincidental. On the following Monday, everything changed. When Silas arrived at his desk, he found a message on his computer terminal. Not an email, not a system notification, but a text file that had been placed directly on his desktop. The file name was simply readme.txt. The message inside was brief. Dr. Lena Voss, former DoD temporal linguistics analyst, presumed dead in 2016. Titor wasn't a hoax. He wasn't first either. He was the last natural variable. Underground parking garage level B3 tonight at 11 p.m. Come alone. Bring the files. Silas stared at the message for a long time. Dr. Lena Voss was a name he recognised from the Orpheus files. She had been one of the lead analysts on the Titor project. According to the documents, she had died in a car accident in 2016, but her analysis of the temporal anomalies had been instrumental in developing the containment protocols. If she was alive, and if she was reaching out to him, then everything was about to change. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia and anticipation. Silas went through the motions of his normal routine, but his mind was racing. He made copies of all the files he'd discovered, storing them on multiple encrypted drives. If this was a trap, he wanted to make sure the information would survive him. At 10:45 p.m, he made his way to the underground parking garage. Level B3 was normally deserted at this hour, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast long shadows between the concrete pillars. The place felt like a tomb sealed off from the world above. She was waiting for him near the elevator bank, but she looked nothing like the woman he had seen across the street. This Dr. Lena Voss was in her 50s, with greying hair and the kind of exhausted look that came from too many years of carrying dangerous secrets. She wore a simple black jacket and jeans, and her eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the shadows for threats. "You found the Orpheus files," she said without preamble. "How much do you know?" "I know that the Titor incident was real," Silas replied. "I know that someone went to extraordinary lengths to cover it up, and I know that you're supposed to be dead." She smiled grimly. Death is a relative concept in this business. I've been dead for 9 years, and it's been the safest 9 years of my life. Until now. What do you mean? I mean that someone with access to the Orpheus files has been poking around, asking questions, making copies, that someone is you, and now they know about me too. Silas felt a chill run down his spine. Who are they? The people who have been managing the timeline for the past 70 years, the people who decided that certain events needed to be erased from history, the people who made sure that John Titor became a joke instead of a warning. She gestured for him to follow her deeper into the garage, away from the elevator and the security cameras. When they reached a secluded corner, she turned to face him. "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible," she said. "But you've already seen the evidence. You know that the official story is a lie. The question is, are you ready to learn the truth?" Silas nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready for anything. "John Titor was real," she continued. "He really was a time traveller from the year 2036, but he wasn't the first. There had been others, small incursions, temporal anomalies that we were able to contain and cover up. Titor was different because he went public. He sent that fax to Art Bell, and suddenly millions of people knew about temporal displacement." "But the timeline," Silas said. "If time travel is real, wouldn't his presence in the past have already changed things?" "That's the thing," Voss replied. "The timeline is more resilient than most people think. Small changes get absorbed, corrected by the flow of events. But major disruptions, public knowledge of time travel, that's different. That threatens the stability of the entire temporal framework." "So they killed him?" "They tried to, but Titor was smart. He knew they were coming. That's why he sent the fax to Bell. It was a dead man's switch, a way to ensure that the truth would survive even if he didn't. But it didn't survive. The broadcast was edited, the story was discredited. That's what they want you to think. But the truth has a way of persisting even when people try to erase it. That's why you found the ORPH-EUS files. That's why you're here now, talking to me." Silas was quiet for a moment, processing what she had told him. What happened to Titor? That's the question, isn't it? According to the official files, he was neutralized. But there are other files, deeper files, that suggest something different. Something that would explain why the timeline has been so unstable lately. What kind of instability? Small things. Events that don't quite line up with the historical record. People who remember things differently than they're supposed to. Temporal echoes that suggest the past is not as fixed as it should be. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. This is a temporal resonance detector. It measures fluctuations in the time stream. Watch. She activated the device and the screen filled with a complex waveform. The pattern was chaotic, full of spikes and valleys that seemed to pulse with an organic rhythm. "This is what the timeline looks like now," she said. "Unstable, fractured. Something is wrong with the fundamental structure of causality itself." "And you think this is connected to the Titor incident?" "I think John Titor didn't just travel through time. I think he broke it, and I think the people who are trying to cover it up are making it worse." She handed him the device. "Take this, monitor the readings. If I'm right, if the timeline is continuing to degrade, then we need to do something about it before it's too late." "What can we do?" "We find the truth. We find out what really happened to John Titor, and we figure out how to fix the mess that's been made of history." As if on cue, the lights in the parking garage flickered and went out. In the darkness, Silas could hear the sound of approaching footsteps, multiple sets, moving with military precision. "They found us," Voss whispered. "Run!" The next few days blurred together in a haze of paranoia and digital archaeology. Silas had managed to escape the parking garage that night, but just barely. Dr. Voss had not been so lucky. When he looked for news of her the next morning, there was no trace, no arrest reports, no missing person filings, nothing. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. But she had given him the tools he needed to continue the investigation. The temporal resonance detector confirmed what she had told him. The timeline was becoming increasingly unstable. The readings showed massive fluctuations, temporal distortions that seemed to be growing stronger by the day. More importantly, she had provided him with access codes to deeper levels of the Orpheus archive. Files that painted a picture of a government conspiracy that stretched back decades, involving not just the Titor incident, but a whole series of temporal anomalies that had been systematically covered up. The deeper files revealed the existence of Project Kronos, a black-budget operation that had been running since 1952. The project was tasked with monitoring and suppressing evidence of temporal displacement, but the files suggested that they had gone far beyond simple observation. They were actively manipulating the timeline, making selective alterations to history to maintain what they called narrative stability. According to the files, the Titor incident had been their greatest challenge. Unlike previous temporal anomalies, which had been private or localized, the Titor facts had been broadcast to millions of people. The normal containment protocols wouldn't work. Instead, they had implemented something called Narrative Severance Protocol, a comprehensive disinformation campaign designed to turn truth into fiction. The protocol had 3 phases. First, they would edit the original broadcast, removing the most convincing elements and replacing them with obvious fabrications. Second, they would seed false information into online forums and discussion groups, creating a confusing web of contradictory claims. Third, they would create a false Titor persona, someone who would post elaborate science fiction stories that would completely discredit the original message. The plan had worked perfectly. By 2001, when the fake John Titor began posting on internet forums, the real message had been completely obscured. The public came to know John Titor as an internet legend, a creative hoaxer who had entertained people with elaborate time travel stories. The real John Titor, the one who had sent that desperate fax to Art Bell, had been erased from history. But Silas was beginning to suspect that the story was even more complex than the files suggested. The temporal resonance detector was showing patterns that didn't match the official timeline. There were echoes, repetitions, suggestions that certain events had been repeated or revised multiple times. He decided to take a risk. Using the access codes that Dr. Voss had provided, he began to search for the deepest files in the Kronos archive. What he found made his blood run cold. The files were labelled Uroboros Protocol, and they contained evidence of something that should have been impossible. The project wasn't just suppressing evidence of time travel. They were engaging in time travel themselves. The files contained detailed logs of temporal operations, missions to specific points in history to make selective alterations. The operations were surgical, precise, designed to change single events without disrupting the larger flow of history. But the cumulative effect was devastating. The timeline had been edited so many times that it was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And at the centre of it all was John Titor. According to the Uroboros files, he hadn't just travelled back in time once. He had made multiple trips, each time trying to prevent a different catastrophe, each time creating new problems that required additional interventions. The files suggested that Titor wasn't just a time traveller. He was trapped in a temporal loop, endlessly repeating the same mission, never quite achieving the results he was looking for. Each iteration of the loop created new timeline branches, new possibilities that had to be managed and contained. But the most disturbing revelation was contained in the final file labelled Subject Profile, Titor, John, real name classified. The file contained biometric data, voice print analysis, and psychological profiles. But it was the photograph that made Silas's world collapse. The face looking back at him from the screen was older, more weathered, but unmistakably familiar. It was his own face, aged by decades of impossible experience. John Titor was Silas Greer. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Everything suddenly made sense. His lifelong insomnia, his fascination with the original broadcast, his ability to access the Orpheus files. He wasn't investigating the Titor incident. He was the Titor incident. The temporal resonance detector in his pocket began to vibrate frantically. The readings were off the charts, suggesting a massive temporal event was about to occur. Around him, reality began to shimmer and distort, as if the fabric of time itself was coming apart. He understood now why the timeline was so unstable. His presence in the past was creating paradoxes, contradictions that the universe was struggling to resolve. Every time he learned more about his own future, he created new branches, new possibilities that had to be managed and contained. The government agents who had been hunting him weren't trying to stop him from revealing the truth. They were trying to prevent him from completing the loop, from becoming the John Titor who would send that fax to Art Bell. But it was too late. The loop was already closing. He could feel it, the pull of destiny, the weight of events that had already been set in motion. In that moment he understood that he had never had a choice. He had been following a script that had been written decades ago, playing out a role that had been predetermined by the laws of causality itself. His last act was to upload everything he had discovered to a series of encrypted servers, hidden in the deep corners of the internet. The files would survive, even if he didn't. Someone else would find them. Someone else would piece together the truth. He typed a final message, his fingers moving with the certainty of someone who had written these same words countless times before. The 5100 was a tool. The broadcast was the ignition. I didn't travel time, I broke it. And now I see everything. The loop was me. As he hit send, the world dissolved around him, reality collapsing into a single point of impossible light. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was his own reflection in the computer screen, but it was different now. Older, wearier, bearing the weight of knowledge that no human mind should have to carry. John Titor was gone. Silas Greer was gone. But the loop continued, as it always had, as it always would. Somewhere in the multiverse, a 10-year-old boy was lying in bed, listening to Art Bell read a fax from a time traveller who claimed to be from the year 2036. The message would always be the same, the warning would always be ignored, and the loop would always close. Time, it seemed, was not a river flowing in one direction. It was a circle, endlessly repeating, endlessly consuming itself. And at the centre of that circle, a voice called out across the years, desperate and urgent and forever unheard. Don't trust the timeline, it's being rewritten. In the end, that was all that remained. The echo of a voice that had been erased from history, the ghost of a man who had tried to change the past, and had only succeeded in ensuring that it would happen exactly as it always had. The Titor files would be discovered eventually, pieced together by someone else who couldn't sleep, someone else who heard voices in the static. The truth would surface, as it always did, but it would be dismissed as fiction, as fantasy, as the delusions of someone who had spent too long staring into the abyss of classified information. And somewhere in the darkness between one moment and the next, between one timeline and another, the loop would continue, eternal and inescapable, a temporal Uroboros devouring its own tail. The listener had remembered. The listener had become the message, and the message would always be the same.